This is the Gospel Media Collaborative, a live stream and podcast in which two followers of Christ converse about a multitude of topics pertaining to the intersection of Christianity and culture. Today's episode is the first in a series entitled God in the Real, in which we examine the thematic elements of Christianity evidenced in secular film. Today's film subject is Interstellar, directed by Christopher Nolan. And my discussant is visual artist Aaron Trout. Aaron, welcome.
Good to be here.
Excellent. Okay, so here is a very terse plot synopsis as written on IMDB of Interstellar. For anybody who's not seen it, which at this point, probably nobody on the face of the earth, but Earth's future has been riddled by disasters, famines, and droughts, and there is only one way to ensure mankind's survival: interstellar travel. A newly discovered wormhole in the far reaches of the solar system allows a team of astronauts to go where no man has gone before, a planet that may have the right environment to sustain human life. Again, very brief plot synopsis, and the movie stars Matthew McConaughey as a pilot and astronaut Joe Cooper, and Hathaway as fellow astronaut Dr. Brand, and Jessica Chastain as Joe Cooper's daughter Murph. And you know, this probably goes without saying, if you have not seen Interstellar, if you are one of the very few people that has not seen it, spoilers ahead.
Yeah.
Also, I have one caveat before we start, and that's you know, there are movies that are explicitly that explicitly claim biblical grounds for their material. And you know, for instance, Darren Aronofsky's Noah and Ridley Scott's Exodus, Gods and Kings. So this series isn't so much about films of that ilk, but it's more about movies that have implicit biblical themes, of which there are many. And the reality is that,
yeah, I mean, you could argue that, you know, the Bible is life. So, you know, if you're
yes,
if you're doing it right, every movie has those themes there. So yeah, storytelling.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Yeah, and the reality is that religion offers rich terrain for cinematic exploration.
The Noah movie would be a good one to talk about at some point, because Darren Aronofsky is actually an atheist, so it'd be an interesting discussion, his take on, you know, but he's Jewish too, so he's got some interesting connections there, what he's trying to do. But yeah, that's another movie for another time.
It's funny, but whenever I think of Darren Aronofsky, I think of Pi. I don't know if you remember Pi. Have you seen Pi? Mm-hmm. Yeah, way back in the day. But of course, I think that kind of catapulted him into, you know, directorial fame. And but you're right, kind of a big irony in him being an atheist. I you know, I wasn't I think completely aware of that, but him being an atheist and directing Noah. So
yeah, I like his movie The Fountain. He's got a movie with Hugh Jackman in it. Yeah, I like that one a lot.
Yeah, and if we're being completely transparent, Aaron, that's one that we talked about. So for anybody who enjoys this episode, if you tune in for future episodes of God in the Real, you'll probably see us discuss The Fountain. So Aaron, I want to mention to you, this is kind of a tangential way to begin this discussion, but one of my favorite parts of Interstellar is when the main character's spacecraft leaves Earth, and Michael Caine's character does the voiceover. He does a recitation of part of Dylan Thomas's poem, "Do not go gentle into that good night." And hands down, for a writer like me, it's one of the best parts of the movie. And actually, when I was a teacher, I used that clip and others in my poetry unit to demonstrate to my students the enduring vivacity of poetry in our modern era. So
yeah, no, I showed the whole movie to my Bible class, and we just I gave him a questionnaire to kind of fill out answers. But yeah, this just kind of as to talk about the movie for a second. You know, some people have different responses to this movie. It's a big movie. It's trying to do a lot of things, and it doesn't really connect with everybody. But it's a beautiful movie. I think it's one of Christopher Nolan's masterpieces. I tend to like Christopher Nolan's movies. He puts a lot of thought into them. One of the criticisms it gets, and that scene that you mentioned kind of brings that up, is the sound. Like, you can't always hear what the characters are saying, and that frustrates some people. But Christopher Nolan, you can tell he was trying to create an experience. Like, if you were getting launched off of the space shuttle, you wouldn't necessarily hear what everyone around you was saying. I think that was kind of the goal there. So it's part of the storytelling, and not everybody likes that, but I watched the movie with headphones in this week, and it was just a great experience. It was almost like watching it in IMAX again, just that surround sound and the immersion. It's really great. And the cinematography is fantastic. The pacing is really good. The storytelling is great. And as far as Christopher Nolan movies go, this one is probably the lightest, as far as like it has the most humor in it, because sometimes his movies can be pretty heavy or nonstop, and so this one actually has good pacing, a little bit of humor. Matthew McConaughey does a really good job carrying some of the humor. The poem is kind of a recurring theme through that movie, and they really use that as one of the plot points. And I think it's interesting, you can use that. The poem comes up in these moments where you have these characters that are, it's almost like there's this subplot of rationality versus intuition. And the characters that quote the poem, you have Dr. John Brand quote it, and then you also have Dr. Mann quote it, and it's interesting because both of those characters quote it to almost justify or rationalize the reason they are making these, what we can call it, evil decisions. And the reason I say evil is because they bring up the notion of evil right before they go to Dr. Mann's planet, and I think that's intentional. You see Michael Caine's character on his deathbed, Dr. Brand, and he's, all the way to his grave, he's saying that poem, and it's almost as a way of him justifying the reason I lied to everybody and deceived everybody. And it ends up hurting the relationships. And really, I think the relationships is the core theme of the movie. Specifically, obviously the father-daughter relationships, and you have the main relationship between the father and the daughter. And I would say the main theme is the ability of love to transcend time and space. It's making the argument that love is a quantifiable force like gravity, because gravity can also transcend time and space. And so this idea that love can transcend time and space is kind of the core truth, if you want to call it, of the movie. And it really carries the plot, and it really focuses on this relationship between Cooper and Murph. And then you also have this contrasted relationship between Dr. John Brand and Dr. Amelia Brand. It's another father-daughter relationship, but it's kind of built on this lie, and he justifies that lie through his poem. And so you have this direct contrast within the movie, these two relationships that should mirror each other, but are actually opposite because of this tension within the film between, kind of using rationality, and like choosing rationality over relationships or intuition. I'm associating intuition with love here because that's what the movie does. And you'll see throughout the movie, every time the characters, even the hero, Matthew McConaughey, there's a point in the movie where they make a decision based on rationality. They have to decide which planet to go to. And Dr. Brand, it's almost kind of flipped, where Dr. Amelia Brand, she's like, hey, we need to go to Edmund's planet. And it turns out she has this long-standing relationship with Edmonds, and McConaughey brings that up, and or Cooper brings that up, and he's like, let's just be transparent here. The reason you want to go there is because you love the guy. And she's like, love is a quantifiable force. It's attracted me. It's saying we need to go to this planet, and it's ironic because the tables have been switched. Cooper has been making almost every decision he makes throughout the movie based on his love for his daughter, compelling him to try and get back to her. And this is the one point in the movie where he switches, or where he changes, and they go to Dr. Mann's planet, and it's a disaster. And so there's these direct repercussions of choosing rationality over love. I was wondering if you saw that, or if that crossed your mind in the movie. I know I covered like half the movie already, but
I was going to say you've really unpacked it, and that was actually a topic I wanted to bring up, and you totally you got it right there. I mean, I would say trope of religion versus scientific rationalism. First off, I don't take it for granted that that's a well, I would take it for granted from a secular perspective that would be a trope in any kind of secular film that does incorporate biblical themes. As a Christian and as a lover and reader of Aquinas, I don't necessarily take religion versus scientific rationalism or rationalism period as a given. I see it as an incorporation. When I think when I went into watching Interstellar for the first time and was kind of witnessing those themes, I kind of defaulted to assuming, okay, he's gonna pit the two against one another. And maybe, to be fair, even in the Christian worldview, there's a bit of that. I wouldn't say there's as much of it as Christians in the modern Christian takes for granted. Like, I can either side with scientific rationalism or I can side with the biblical worldview. I think you and I have kind of touched upon that subject. I believe they're very much incorporated. To me, they've been very much incorporated, such Aquinas in what I think the 14th century. And so I kind of, in some senses, I tire of that trope when I see it in as a kind of an underlying biblical theme or an allusion. In this case, I think because it can be so finely parsed. I believe the movie is somewhat fair in that it makes love as a choice, and then
I would agree.
I guess a rationalistic choice.
Well, I think the movie is trying to subvert the traditional sci-fi position where rationality is the kind of I want to say the word divine kind of guiding force through the movie, is like rationality, scientism, this devotion to making the rational choice, and usually the irrational characters are the ones that get eaten by the alien or whatever, and so it's almost, in a sense, an anti-sci-fi movie by flipping it like that. And maybe the writers were trying to subvert that trope, because a lot of times a writer who's trying to be creative with a certain genre, will take stereotypes within the genre and subvert them. And so maybe that's what's happening here. I haven't found anything on this movie was written by Christopher Nolan and his brother Jonathan, and I haven't been able to find anything on their religious beliefs or anything. I haven't really dug too deep. I'm sure there's some interviews where they maybe mention something here or there, and I don't think they're necessarily they're obviously not overtly religious, but some of these themes do pop up, so they may have some kind of background in that. They definitely seem like moral characters. It'd be hard for them to be moral and write a movie like this that has a lot of kind of moral underpinnings, but I do like how overt this kind of theme is. And I think a lot of people who are traditionally into sci-fi movies ended up having a negative response to this movie, partially because of that. They expected it to kind of be, and you'll find this a lot, especially like in the Star Trek movies, where they adhere a lot to the Humanist Manifesto. And so we can talk more about that if you want. I really like some of the ideas in the Humanist Manifesto I actually like a lot, and that might be shocking coming from a Christian, but the idea of a society where you no longer have these nationalistic borders or tensions, nationalistic tensions, I think would be a good way to say it, and also this kind of acquisition economy where it's about getting things and having money, and so Those are tenets and general ideas within the Humanist Manifesto that I think recognize there's something broken with the world we're in right now, and also point to the future kingdom when Jesus establishes his kingdom here on earth, and becomes the central government. The government will be on his shoulders, and I think we can, instead of just outright rejecting people who have this Humanist Manifesto as kind of their guiding morality, I think as Christians we can come together on that in many ways, instead of just outright rejecting it and being kind of vociferous about our response to that. We can actually have some bridges connect there, and I think that comes with a proper understanding of what Jesus plans to do in the future about having a kingdom here on earth, and us participating in that. So
I completely agree, and specifically on the utopianism kind of vision that's usually firmly rooted in humanism, or more rooted in secular humanism. And there's so much, honestly, so much ground to cover in Star Trek. Like I think you're
yes.
getting it.
Yeah.
Gene Roddenberry was also not just an atheist. He was what you might say, Christopher Hitchens would say, an anti-theist.
Yeah.
By what I remember reading about him, he did not like faith in any way, shape, or form, and you can see that reflected in the more traditional themes of Star Trek. But I guess I digress. There is tremendous amount to say about Star Trek. I will say this, because the last time you and I spoke over live stream, we're starting this with a science fiction film, which kind of like what in paralleling what you were saying, in some senses this is kind of the easy route, because you and I hypothesized last time how we both believe, like you brought this up, and I have always thought it, and we have never talked about it before, but how we both believe that some of the tropes of science fiction may actually be the ultimate manifestation of humanity's future, in the new heavens, the new earth, the new kingdom, i.e. things like expansionist space travel, and so science fiction seems to take that and claim it as it's almost like it has this utopian vision. We know, like you were saying, I don't want to misquote you, but it's like the implicit understanding, like this is our vision, this is where we're meant to go. It's usually given the more colloquial like blanket of secular humanist goal. But I believe, like you do, that this is actually more of a biblical theme, and that the future, who knows, obviously this is a matter of great complexity, but perhaps humanity is meant to be traversing the stars in its new kingdom.
Yeah, it's not just meant to traverse the stars, it's meant to live in harmony. It's meant to, not die. It's meant to, endure in a just and cooperative society. And when some people, when they see those things written down in the Humanist Manifesto, they'll be like, well, they're just trying to, socialism or whatever. They'll use their catchphrases or whatever. And I think the reality of it is, any system that utilizes biblical principles is going to be successful. So if you apply biblical principles, love your neighbor as yourself, to capitalism or socialism, it's going to have success. And as soon as you take those biblical principles out, you'll have the same failings within each one. There's no when sin enters the picture, there's no real advantage to either system, and the truth of it is, neither system will exist in the kingdom, in the future kingdom. So hanging your hat on either one is it's kind of a crooked path. It's not going to be, it's going to be bumpy. So yeah, there's something better we can work towards, and I think the Humanist Manifesto is a recognition that we're meant for something better, and I think we can come together on that, rather than create division. So
yeah, good stuff. And it's funny, whenever like all the things you mentioned in that utopian vision are brought up in a science fiction context, I would say that typically there is an open exclusion of the concept of sin, and even though there might be an implicit acknowledgement of it. For instance, in this film, I think Matt Damon's character, I mean, first of all, he's called Dr. Mann. You know, it's
Right.
Mann, but it's,
Yeah.
to me, it's just so, as a writer especially,
Yes.
I mean, using title tropes and as insinuations of a character's character and what's
Yeah.
the meaning, it's very common in literature, and I would assume it's fairly common in film as well. And in this case,
Right.
it is. It's, Dr. Mann, from what I remember in the film, is somewhat, he has benevolent, at least he claims benevolent interests and objectives, but then he ends up kind of having the worst qualities
Yeah.
in his goal. So I don't know, what do you think of
Well,
Matt Damon's character?
so yeah, I mean, he's a major kind of, he's kind of the pivot point of the film, and you have, in the lead up to him even showing up on film, he's touted as like, Dr. Amelia Branch. She's like, oh, he's the best of us. Always you have all these glowing comments about Dr. Mann, Dr. Mann, Dr. Mann, and right when the duplicity of Dr. John Brand's kind of lie appears is right when we meet Dr. Mann. And just going back to like, the overtness of his name, it's like once you recognize it, it almost seems kind of cheesy. It's like, man, it's just kind of like in your face. But when you're watching the movie for the first time, you're like, oh, Dr. Mann, that's a cool name, And so, but yeah, anyway, but yeah, I really, right before they go to meet him, they have that conversation in the ship, can nature be evil? And the conclusion was only what we bring with us. And I think that there's truth in that nature itself has had sin thrust upon it. Nature groans in response to the fallenness of mankind, and so and also we talked about spiritual beings in the past, these fallen beings who kind of perpetuate that as well. And so you have these characters, and Dr. Mann using, again, rationality. He doesn't have true compassion. He says he has compassion. He says he wants, Cooper to see his kids as he's dying, but he's like, he's cracked his helmet, he's thrown him onto the ground, and he's left him there to die. And so for both those characters, Dr. John Brand and Dr. Mann, I automatically think of Sarchi and Bad Faith, and where you have, these characters. It's like the poem itself embodies bad faith. It's like when your back is against the wall, do whatever is necessary to continue. Like it's almost like morality goes out the window if you're going to die. It's like no one else matters. Don't go gently into that good night. Don't take your death with grace. Fight and claw your way to existence, even if you have to step on somebody else almost. And that's not what the poem says explicitly, but I think that's how it's playing out in these two characters that used it to justify their actions. Where the other characters who are using their intuition and their love, you could also juxtapose the poem for them where they are reacting in a different way, where their intuition combined with this desire to not go gently into that good night results in actions that build relationships rather than tear them down. So
Fantastic insight. So Matt Damon's character, Dr. Mann, is kind of like this. He eventually resorts to the Machiavellian, completely selfish, rationalizing his selfishness in his actions.
All the way up until his death. Like
yeah.
he's halfway through a sentence of like, I'm doing this for all mankind. Blah,
yeah.
He dies. It's a pretty awesome scene, actually.
Yeah. You know what? I think that's a fairly titular point because, one thing about where we live in today, with the society we live in, it's I don't know if I touched upon this last time you and I spoke, but one issue I think with people comprehending their circumstances is in not making an open acknowledgement of to put it from a standpoint of G.K. Chesterton, the journalist, who I love, not acknowledging the underlying ruin. He had the saying where it was the original magnificence intended for humanity, but incorporated with the underlying ruin. So when we live, what we live in today, secular culture, is very much an embrace of uh, secular humanism and the potential for humanity, without the acknowledgement of how it's been defaced. And so, of course, the Christian makes the acknowledgement that it's been defaced, that there's this sin, or I love the Augustine's, it's a homo incurvatus in se, the Latin phrase that means man turned in on himself. And I like this movie because of that moment, where it makes it fairly explicit, like you were saying, where he's completely, he's motivated by his own selfishness, but he's trying to rationalize it. And so I like the open recognitions of sin. I try and not be one-sided. You know, I don't want to be the Christian that's just like sin, sin, sin.
Right. Yeah.
But I don't want to be the secularist who's like, hey, vision, utopia, potential, because neither is true in both our ideological claims, from a biblical standpoint.
Right. Well, there's a couple points I also want to touch on here, is where, you know, we kind of connect this to secular humanism, but it's really easy to see on the internet and on TV how a lot of people who call themselves Christians rationalize their own kind of selfish behavior, or nationalistic behavior even, you know, in very much the same way. And so it's an issue that really carries, you know, this idea of bad faith. You know, there are lots of people who say they're Christians, but when it comes to their livelihoods, or their nationalistic propensities, or their even their personal rights, they will abandon the tenets of the Christian faith if they even recognize them to begin with at all. And so, you know, that's kind of the epitome of bad faith. It's like, you know, when your back's against the wall, do you stand to those things that you say you believe, or do you abandon them? And you see this widespread abandonment within I'm going to call it a Christian culture. I don't know how, like, I'm creating a separation there between someone who genuinely adheres to what Jesus taught and what he said of himself and what he said about what he's going to do in the future. And so it creates this kind of disconnect, I think. And one of the reasons we have secular humanism is a response to this kind of religious justification for evil, in a lot of, you know, all throughout history. You know, you could even, you know, Constantine was very much a nationalistic, conquering, you know, individual. He used Christianity as kind of his justification for that. And I would question the validity of his faith, because that's very much something that's not going to be part of the future kingdom, a conquering nations. You know, the whole conquest kind of ideology is very much something that Jesus is coming back to destroy. And so, you know, I would just use caution when identifying anyone who conquers in that kind of nationalistic sense. You're very much going against the teachings of Jesus in that sense. And so a lot of times we just think of Christianity as applying to personal sin, when it also has a lot to do with nationalistic sin. And I think a good word here is corruption. And so we come back to, you know, those spirit beings that have authority and that have dominion on the earth, that are corrupting the earth in kind of this way, you know. And so you have this negative influence that leads to nations conquering other nations and people destroying other people. These kind of conflicts. That's kind of the source of that. And so it becomes an issue when you involve the name of Jesus in that, and you use that as justification for it. And so I've definitely learned to kind of separate what I read in the gospel from, nationalistic justifications for actions, you trying to use the Bible to do that. So I don't know if that makes sense to you, or if you've, thought of that at all.
No, especially, in our current cultural moment. I would tend to agree with everything you've said. I probably take, in terms of, like, you gave it a really good exegesis. But what it made me think of immediately was C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. It's like he has that book divided up into, I think he calls them books. They're more like chapters,
Yeah.
But whatever his sections, because I think he was originally reading it out on a radio broadcast. But he does mention I forgot how he phrases it, so I'm paraphrasing. He says, there are those things that are good in and of themselves, like he brings up mother love and sex, and he does, I think, mention patriotism. And he says they are meant to be good things, but they're not meant to. But if you make them the ultimate thing, then it suddenly flips them on their head, and you bring out the underlying ruin and evil of each of them, and how they can, I think, using your own words, corrupt. So that's kind of I love C.S. Lewis's, exegesis like yours, and in mentioning patriotism, he uses the word patriotism as opposed to nationalism. I think there's always a rational in the middle, because, as long as we're in this place, this reality, to some extent, you can never have peace and love, and I don't think you're saying this, but peace and love and open borders, and
we're not in the kingdom yet.
Exactly. Not in the kingdom yet. So I think C.S. Lewis would completely agree with you.
Well, I think it comes back to relationships. The easiest decisions to make are the smaller ones, and so it's when you're thinking about voting, or you're thinking about patriotism, start local. If you really care about your country, care about the people in your backyard first. The gospel mandate, to the disciples was Jerusalem first, then Samaria, and then the othermost parts of the earth. The start was their hometown. They were supposed to start in their hometown, then they were going to go to their neighbor town, and then they were supposed to spread out from there. And I think a lot of people, they're trying too hard to change the world, but they're walking right past the homeless person on their street, and so there's a problem there. And you got it backwards, basically. And so when you're thinking about those things, that's where you need to start, I think.
Excellent. Yeah, very good stuff. I heard somebody, a famous speaker whose name I will not mention because, he said the very same thing you did. It's don't worry about broad scale social change until you've dealt with the conflict in your family, or until you've resolved your own, your own space or your own house. And I think, like you were saying, that's the way it's meant to be. It's a prioritization or hierarchy of care. So let me ask you this: what did you think of in Interstellar's universe? It has benevolent, unseen beings who come to lead humanity out of crisis. To me, that was kind of at least ostensibly, the God figure. It was like humanity in the future doing that.
Right. Well, I think that's where the Humanist Manifesto kind of comes back into play. Like the whole movie, they're subverting it, and then at the very end, they're like, well, it's actually the hero of the movie, because Matthew McConaughey, he's like, they didn't bring us here, we did. We brought ourselves here. And so that's kind of the Humanist Manifesto, like really summed up. And it's kind of interesting because it's almost tongue in cheek, just based on what the rest of the movie was saying about that. And so it's interesting. It's like you have these divine beings coming back, who are just evolved human beings. And you could draw some parallels to there. I mean, one of the reasons Satan's lie worked on Eve so well was because he was using a lot of truth. God's intention was for us to become like gods, so to speak, or like these sons of God beings that you find in the Bible. We're intended to God intended for us to grow beyond where we were in the garden and in his time. And so the real sin in the garden, the rebellion, was to take it for ourselves rather than let God develop us and let us grow. It's like, you know, it's not like the tree of knowledge of good and evil was evil in and of itself. It was that we weren't ready for it. It was like, you know, giving a kid a porno mag or something. You know, it's like, you know, we weren't ready for it. You know, look at what happens with technology when we develop technology. It's not that technology is bad, but we're not mature enough as a species to handle it correctly. And I think that's a lot of what the new kingdom will be about, is that, you know, we've matured, and God takes those who have aligned with his vision of what humanity ought to be, and gives us glorified bodies that allow us to live on into the future with this matured sense of reality, and the ability to have that we have this knowledge of good and evil, but to use it for the betterment of mankind and the betterment of nature and the universe that God is kind of giving to us, so that we can rule it like he intended, and not corrupt it, as we have been.
Excellent.
So I think there's a connection there.
Yeah, I would agree. And I'd also say, like you mentioned just a little bit earlier, there's kind of a pivoting back and forth between, I'd say, you know, traditional Christian meta-narrative and then the secular humanist narrative. Because, you know, when I was looking at, okay, these future human beings seem to be at least ostensibly the God position, you know, personification.
Yeah.
And then humanity's salvation, you know, in the film requires the main characters to have faith in a power that they can't completely know empirically. They know that they're there, and there's a communication, but it's the manifestation is not a way that they're familiar with. So I thought, okay, that seems to be like a biblical, some kind of underlying biblical motive there. And then, of course, self-sacrifice is rampant throughout the movie. You know, we see in some of the major characters, a lot of the major characters, they exhibit some form of self-sacrifice. And that's something I love personally. If there's nothing that could, you know, if you had to sum up the Christological story in one word, I'd say self-sacrifice, or I guess a hyphenated word.
Absolutely.
What do you think about the self-sacrifice trope?
Oh, for sure. I mean, it's built into kind of the idea of love. You know, the characters who were connected by love, and were using intuition based on that connection. You know, they were selfless and self-sacrificing. And the complete opposite is true of the characters that were using rationality, cold rationality, without this. You know, they had thrown away their love connection, and so their rationality ended up failing them, and so, you know, I think Einstein said I can't remember the quote, I'd have to go look it up, but Einstein said something about rationality being the obedient master of intuition, something like that. And so don't quote me on that. Don't quote me on that quote, but I think it's a really good statement, how, you know, rationality without intuition dehumanizes us. And I think that's what you see is these characters that have lost that, they lose their ability to love. And I think it's really cool, just the fact that, you know, it kind of pairs love with gravity here. And it's trying to say that love is a quantifiable force like gravity, which is funny because we can't quantify gravity yet. But the fact that both of those forces are attracting forces, I think that's an interesting idea. It's kind of fun that they played with that. And then so they use that, and I think that's the connection that, you know, the future beings, like we were talking about, the connection of these godlike beings to the contemporary humanity. That connection is that love, because that's one of the few things that is quantifiable across time and space. But yeah, it definitely ties into self-sacrifice. You see these characters, you know, the ones that self-sacrifice are the ones that still have that love connection, the part that makes them human. Yeah, so
Good stuff. Yeah. I actually, before we started talking, it was initially my intention to point out that, you know, while it's easy to find biblical themes throughout science fiction, literature, and film in general, my thought was that the genre seemed bifurcated, because in some sci-fi mediums, Christian themes predominate, and in others, and this may be the smaller camp, there's an extremely secular ethos that predominates. But so that was my original intention to say that. I think after having our conversation, there's probably, maybe it's trifurcated. I don't know if that's a word, but you know, so like you could say there's this center strand of a mix of the two, and that's probably the most predominating. But you know, I would put Interstellar in the dominantly biblical, you know,
yeah,
ethos. And I think a large part of, when you look at sci-fi, a large part of which direction it may go is dependent on the progenitor of that particular work. For instance, you know, we can find these biblical themes in Interstellar. Some of which can be interpreted as agnostic, but many are in accord with
right,
biblical themes. But then I take something like, I don't know if you're familiar with Arthur C. Clarke, who himself, he was a militant atheist. And if you're not
yes,
familiar,
yeah,
if anybody listening isn't familiar with his name, they would certainly have heard of his books and his movies and short stories, that, like, for instance, 2001 Space Odyssey.
yeah,
I had to read Childhood's End, which I'm sure very few people have heard of. There was a novel that he wrote. And it absolutely, like, I'm using hyperbole, but brutalized my childhood as a Christian, because he takes a lot of biblical themes and just upends them completely.
yeah,
And so it's not like it caused me to, like, question my faith or anything like that, but it's definitely in the camp of the secular humanistic manifesto.
right.
There is no God. God is hateful. We need to destroy religion. And and there are other more recent, you know, maybe I'm getting off topic, but there are other more recent examples of that, like Ex Machina. I don't know if you saw that movie.
I know, I know of the movie. It was on my list somewhere, but I mean, media has gotten so ubiquitous. It's you can't watch everything anymore. So you got to pick and choose. But yeah, I did Arthur C. Clarke write All Summer in a Day? Was that one of his, or was that somebody else?
I'm not. Is that a short story?
It was I saw it as a short film. I know it's
Okay.
a short story. It might have been someone other than Arthur C. Clarke, another sci-fi writer. But when you said childhood, that it took me there, because it's this really depressing story. You can look it up later, but it doesn't really have anything to do with what we're doing. But anyway, yeah, as a matured, and I consider myself a mature Christian. Maybe others would differ on that, but when I see, you know, anytime morality is brought up, it, from my perspective, you can't have morality without God showing up. You know, a world without God is a world without morality. So even the humanists, in their best efforts, if they have any morality at all, they are invoking God, whether they want to or not. And I find that humorous. Humanists probably, you know, sweat at night before they go to bed, you know, thinking about stuff like that. But that's how I see it. So I don't get afraid of these story ideas, because for me, if there's any morality in the movie, it always comes back to God and who He is and what He's trying to do. And a lot of times when people try to dump these negative things on God, you know, it's like, you know, the age-old question, why would God allow this to happen? And our modern answer tends to be, well, God works in mysterious ways. And yes, the Bible does say that, but the Bible also says that there are these fallen, corrupt gods, and they are very much in charge of the earth right now. And the hope and the promise of Jesus is that He's coming back to destroy them. You know, it's not this hopeless situation. And so a lot of time, instead of that other question, we should be asking, well, why would the gods let this happen? They were put in charge. They could do a good job, but they're not. And if you want to see that played out in the scripture, just read Psalm 82, where God spends the whole chapter chastising them and saying he's going to destroy them. And so it becomes this kind of straw man where humanists are taking, their ignorance about the true geospiritual nature of the world, and thrusting all the brokenness from that situation onto God, who's actually already put a plan in motion to fix it. And it's really that simple. And when you have that clear biblical worldview, the world becomes a lot more, it is sad because it's broken, but there's also this hope and a peace that comes with it, because the end of the story, what's coming, and every day it comes ever closer. And just when you see God working through history and the role Jesus played in that, and how definite and just kind of in control God has been about the past, it becomes, it's like watching your favorite sports team blow out another team. Like, it's like, 1,000 points to 0, it's like not even close. Why'd the other team even show up to play? Because it's no contest. And when you have that understanding of the world, that's where that peace that passes understanding comes from. And it gives you the freedom to love people, because you're not worried about you don't have a sense of finality to your life. It's like, this is like a prequel to what life will be. And that's what you're looking forward to. You're not so caught up in the here and now. It's like most people today can't see past their own day-to-day existence. And so they're so worried about hanging on to that and preserving that and making it comfortable, that they can't see the kingdom that's coming. And that's that, and I'm thinking mostly about Christians. I'm not thinking about secular humanists at this point. And so if you have Christians who can grasp that and have that peace and that confidence in what God is doing in the world, and how he's coming to redeem all things, to redeem the environment, to redeem government, to redeem technology, to redeem, us as a people and our relationships, and take us back to that garden state where what he intended. Secular humanists would their numbers would dwindle, because people would see, people would be able to grasp what the kingdom is going to be like more and more, because the more of us who live kingdom-mindedly, that future kingdom in our hearts, and apply that to our daily lives, we're going to have that selfless, sacrificial love, because we know there's a future for our lives. I could easily go to the grave dying so that someone else can endure. I could easily sacrifice my life here and now, because I know this body is corrupt and I'm going to get a new one. When Jesus returns, he's going to give me a new body. And so I'm not too worried about this one. I definitely need to take care of it and not eat too many cookies. But yeah, it kind of creates the realization of what God is doing, creates that kind of love for your neighbor. It's almost like a feedback loop, where the more you understand the truth, the more it manifests itself in your life, and the more it manifests itself in your life, the more you recognize that truth. And that's where that peace comes from, and that's where that intimacy with God comes from, because you really start to understand his heart for the world, and why he sacrificed himself for that. But yeah, I also wanted to, I'm sure you have some thoughts on that, but I also wanted to bring up this idea of, within movies in general, unintentional truths, like things that are said or brought up in a film where the director wasn't necessarily trying to say this or that, but they kind of manifest themselves anyway. One point is where, you know, you have Cooper, and he's kind of frustrated. He's like sitting on his front porch, and he's about to leave to go to outer space, and he's just talking about how man wasn't meant to let me see. I think I wrote it down somewhere. Where did I write? I wrote that down somewhere. Oh yeah, mankind was born on Earth, but it was never meant to die here. You know, and his point was that, you know, we were meant to explore and to push on beyond ourselves, and I think that's part of our future, like we talked about. But I find it true because we weren't meant to die at all, you know, and so I think there's these truths that kind of manifest themselves within film. Even a secular humanist who is trying to use the story to discredit religion, specifically organized religion or this concept of God, or just promote, you know, the kind of secular humanist worldview, still ends up coming back and defeating itself, just because the truth of our reality is that it's rooted in a all-knowing, loving creator. Yeah, so that's kind of something I was thinking about while watching this movie.
Good stuff. Good stuff. And first, I just want to say about your dissertation earlier, right before you went into this new topic. Yeah. Really, it was a dissertation about the gospel, and I couldn't have said it any better myself. And kind of addressing what you just said just now, the more recent. I was kind of thinking that a lot of non-believers or secular viewers would probably see these things that you and I are looking at as naturally occurring as a consequence of the biblical influence on Western society, and that it's just those things are ubiquitous. You can't get rid of them, or at least the getting rid process for people who would want to get rid of them, that's going to take, maybe millennia more.
Right.
We see these things, as predominating even in this entire series of podcasting. We see them as, in some senses, proofs, because the creators, the progenitors of these movies, the writers are human, and in the human condition, they're permeated with these same truths that we think are really self-evident. Like you were saying, the human heart longs for immortality. Why is that? You were bringing up, really, honestly, you were making me think of a lot of Christopher Hitchens debates that I've watched, a lot of things where he makes very terrible claims or very spurious arguments, and he doesn't even answer the question about, hey, how do you explain an objective morality? You and I take that, the existence of an objective morality as fact, for granted, that this is the case. When it comes down to it, somebody else might try and be reductive, and in my opinion, be reductive and make less of it than it actually is. But those things are there. That's kind of what it comes down to. If you want to say it's just part of Western society, those tropes in Western society, okay. But if the fact remains, you can traverse through other cultures and societies and see these things at play, the existential longings. This film, Interstellar, is really one of the most existential of Christopher Nolan's creations, I would say. So there's so much more to say. I was thinking of ending it this way. In terms of being that the kind of the general ethos of the show is like the biblical accord or the biblical tropes according with film, secular film. What is, on a scale of 1 to 10, because we're kind of movie critics here, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the most, 1 being the least, what would you give this film in terms of its, incorporation of biblical themes and maybe it's not intended accuracy, but its accuracy of those themes?
Well, as far as its accuracy of how it communicates love and truth, and I would give it a 10, just because I think it correctly identifies the importance of love and relationships over rationality. I think we found in our current age that you can rationalize pretty much anything, and so rationality has become, like, I think we live in a post-rational age. And so rationality is a good tool, but it is not a master, so to speak. It shouldn't be a master. And I think, when you make rationality and reason your religion, and this, I'm not saying, it might sound like I'm singling out secular humanists here, but the same effects in our modern culture have played out within the ranks of Christianity as well, where we try too hard to rationalize a narrative that is built on love and relationships. And so I think the movie correctly identifies love and relationships. Watching this movie, it's a grand, beautiful movie. The cinematic, I mean, the bigger the screen you watch it on, the better. The experience, the sound, everything. But something that carries more weight through the movie than all of that are the relationships. The relationships are even more epic than the visuals, so to speak. And sometimes you think it's just the visuals, but really music is bringing out your emotions. It's bringing out your feelings, and it's almost, you think you like it because of what you see and the science and the, these other things, but really it's the emotions and the relationships that are carrying the movie, that are giving the movie weight and are giving the movie meaning. And I think we miss that a lot, and we try to rely too much on the other, and it really subverts who we are supposed to be as human beings and as children of the Creator. So.
I would say you're a regular Siskel and Ebert here in one person. That was a great assessment, a really good assessment. I too, I agree with you. I would give it a 10. It's so many parallels. The ones we spoke of, the universe has benevolent, unseen beings. Humanity's salvation requires them to have faith in a power they can't completely know empirically. The self-sacrifice, the ultimate outcome of the film depends on the return of a character. And then Matt Damon's Dr. Mann is kind of personifying the sinful, selfish nature of the human condition. So yeah, I think we're in one accord over this is a 10 out of 10, 2 thumbs up.
Yeah, post that on your page when you upload the.
Yeah, definitely will do. Well, awesome. So yeah, thanks so much, Aaron. It's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for being, as usual, fantastic discussant, and I look forward to our talk in the future.
Yeah, as do I.
Okay, talk to you later.
All right, man. Bye.
Bye.